Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. This is our summer series called Royalty and Romance. Today's class is dedicated to nishmat Henry Rosen alav shalom, Chaim Eliezer ben Yehoshuah Tzvi alav shalom, by his daughter Pam Lunzer. Please make berachot ele nishmato. All of the learning today should help his neshama make a greater and greater aliyah. Okay. So before I begin, I just want to make a little bit of a disclaimer. I do feel a little outnumbered. This is predominantly, there are women in this class today. And I know that today's subject is going to be somewhat sensitive and touchy. And what I don't want this to become like the Donahue show or like the Oprah Winfrey show. I know that we're going to get heated and emotional about this topic. And while I don't have great answers, I definitely have a perspective. So I'm asking that, as we go through this, and if you feel the urge to kind of like blurt something out, or, I'm asking you to kind of hold back a little bit. Let's finish the class. I'll try to end the class a little bit earlier so that we can kind of go through the questions. We're not going to finish all this today, because there's a lot to unpack with David and Batsheva. The truth is, I'll be honest, as I was preparing it, I myself was struggling with a lot of the psukim. It's very hard to understand, not an easy subject at all. And so I'm just giving you that as a little bit of a introduction, before we begin. This is a subject that will kind of like occupy our conversation here for the next couple of weeks. So just be mindful that there will be some questions that may not be answered, but I'm confident that together we will go through this and we'll get clarity, and we'll try to put everything in proper perspective. So we spoke the last few weeks about, we went through Tamar and Yehuda. We went through the story of Tamar and Yehuda and their relationship. We dealt with that a little bit. We went through a little bit of Ruth and Boaz last week, and we discussed that as well. If you are missing those classes, I have the recordings. I'm happy to send them to you. They're all recorded. I have all the source sheets for all that as well. I'm happy to share everything with you. Definitely worth listening to the classes before, because these are all a binyan. Each class is a building upon the discussions that we've had before. So this week we're going to try to tackle Batsheva and David. Now, I will remind you all that the Torah is not interested in covering anything up. And as we read this, I want you to be mindful of the fact that the Torah could have easily ignored this. The Tanakh could have easily ignored the story. We'd have never known. We'd have never known any of the details. But the fact that the Torah goes out of its way to tell us about the details, to tell us what David was thinking, to show us what was happening a little bit behind the scenes, we have to ask ourselves why. Why was this necessary, this particular story necessary to be included in the story itself? Okay? So I want that to be there. Like, remember, the Torah could have easily glossed this over. We don't need to know the story. We could just tell us a story that David marries another wife named Batsheva, and that's it, and we start from there. I don't need to know if she was married before. I don't need to know about the story. Why are we even sharing this story? There's so much drama in the story. It literally reads like a soap opera, right? And it begs the question, like, why is it even here? What are we meant to learn from this? What are we supposed to take away from this story? How do we, reconcile that when we're reading about David? Try your hardest, and I know it's difficult to do this. He's not just a king, our king, Melech David, Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam. He's not just a king, the father of Shlomo, the father of, the line of the Messianic kingdom. But, he's also a Navi, he's a prophet. He's somewhat of a saint. He's somewhat of someone who we revere. He's one of the people that come and visit us on Sukkot as the Ushpizin. We sing songs about him. We treat him as a righteous person. But when we read the story, you're going to have a hard time understanding how we reconcile someone as saintly as David, as someone who could have gone through an episode with David and Batsheva. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, just don't worry about it. We'll get there. Okay, so let's go through the Pesukim itself. So the Pesukim, all of this is found in the book of Shmuel Bet. Right at this point, David has already established his kingdom. Shmuel Aleph dealt with the fact that Shaul was the first king and how the Jewish people set up the kingdom, how Shaul perishes, and how David takes over and starts his kingdom first in Hebron, and then eventually moves the kingdom to Jerusalem. Now, when we think of Jerusalem, the city itself, just so that you have it clear in your mind, that the Kotel and the Temple Mount, where it is today, the city did not move to the northern part of the city, but the actual city of David was on the southern part of the city. Okay, and therefore, if you were going today to Ir David, is a fascinating tour where you go down outside of Shar Ashpa, the Dung Gate, and you keep going down in that area there. That is the city of David, which would fit very nicely to the way in which they structured the actual city, which was the people dwelt in the lower part of the mountain and more closer into the valley. And that was where most ancient civilizations, they set themselves up, where the lower class people live on the bottom and the upper class people live on top. But over here, the upper class people were not the wealthy aristocrats. It was the Kohanim, the priests, the teachers, the educators, the Sanhedrin, a different structure in the ancient world of how in which we thought of those people that had value. The people that were on top of the hill were the holy, spiritual, educated, learned, not the wealthy, not the powerful. Anyone and everyone, including even David HaMelech, lived in the same area as the other people. The truth is, this was the capital city, so it already had attracted a certain type of person, a wealthier kind of person, a more educated kind of person. But for the most part, as far as we see the way in which Ir David was laid out, it was one nice big chunk. Everyone lived together in the same plane, but the people of intelligence, the priests, the Sanhedrin, they were a little bit higher up in the mountain as a way of showing them that these people were more chashuv, more important than the people that live down here, which was again the opposite. In the ancient world, you had the patricians and the plebs. The patricians were the wealthy class, and they always lived on top of the mountain. And the plebs, the plebeians, the people that were poor, the servant class, always lived in the valleys, and they were to come up every single day into the higher parts of the mountain to do their service and so on and so forth, as a way of a physical demarcation of your status. We're literally upper class on the top of the mountain, you're lower class in the valley. That was not happening during the time of King David. Certainly that's not the way Jews see value. We see value in intelligence. We see value in service to God. We see value in those people who were doing chesed and kindness and so on and so forth. That was what we put on top of the mountain. Okay, so the pasuk begins, Vayhib the Shuvat Hashana. We're talking about the return of the year. This is the time when the kings will go into the battle. We're talking about sometime in and around Shavuot. We're talking about the time where most of these wars took place. It's still very common today in Israel. You'll notice that most of the wars in the Middle East happen around the spring and the summertime. They don't start in the winter. It's too cold. It's rainy. No one wants to fight in the rain. So we wait for the rainy season to be over, and that's when we start our wars. So you know that if you're visiting Israel between November and April, don't worry about any wars. You'll be safe at that time. The time to be worried most about anything breaking out in the Middle East is from right around Pesach until Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot. That's the time where most of these things happen. This is the same thing happened way back then as well. Okay, Vishlach David at Yoav. David sends his servant Yoav to the Jewish people. He does not go out to war, but instead he sends out his trusted general Yoav. Okay, but David Yashab Yerushalayim. This is interesting. The king over here sat in Jerusalem. Now, up until now, David wasn't the kind of king that sat and ruled his kingdom from his throne. Every battle that took place, David was not just a ruler; he was a military genius. He was, in this way, in many ways, like Alexander the Great. He went out and conquered the cities with his people. He fought the wars, he fought the battles, and we know this because later on, when David wanted to build the Beit HaMikdash, what happens? God says you can't. Your hands are stained with blood. That's right. Your hands were stained with blood, and therefore, you can't have someone whose hands were stained with blood build a temple in a city called Yerushalayim, the city of peace. Jerusalem was supposed to be a place of peace. But you can't have a warrior whose hands were sullied with blood build the temple, which is supposed to be emblematic of that kind of peace. Shlomo HaMelech comes at the scene a little bit later, which even makes this whole story even much more profound, because we're talking about a boy who was born from a questionable, interesting relationship, and we'll see that as well. Okay, so it comes the evening. David gets up, right, from his bed, and he walks up on the roof of the king's house, and he sees a woman bathing from the roof. And the woman was very, very beautiful. Okay? And David sent, and he finds out about this woman and said, "Isn't that Batsheva, the daughter of Eliam, right? The wife of Uriah the Hittite, right? Why was he Hittite? Two explanations. We know the Hittites were not Jews. So one opinion is that Uriah was actually a convert, and that he converted to Judaism, and he left the Hittites and became Jewish. And that's one interpretation. The other interpretation is that he lived with the Hittites and left. Either way, he was either someone who was a Baal Teshuvah, who became more observant, or he was a convert, but he was not from the typical camp of the Jews. So he was already somewhat different. Okay. David sends messengers, and he takes this Batsheva, and she came to him and laid with her, and she was purified, right? And she was tahora, right? Mitgadeshet metumata v'tashav el beita, and she returned to her house. So there was this interesting, very interesting kind of union that happens over here. Yishkav ima. We're not talking about they just sat there and lied down and stared at each other in the eyes. Something much more profound was happening with this shchiva. Okay, and now we know. And how do we know that? Because the pasuk says, "V'taher ha'isha," and she conceived. V'tishlach v'teged leDavid v'tomer hara anochi, I am pregnant. Okay, so here you have what seems like from the pasukim a king who's doing like some moonlighting. He's looking out on his throne, and he sees a woman who's bathing on her rooftop, and she's beautiful, and he's attracted to her, and he sends out word. He sends her to find out who she is, and we know that she's the wife of Uriah. Okay, now. Okay, we're going to get there. Hold on, slow. It's already starting. We didn't even get to the juicy parts, and it's starting already. Hold on, we're going to get there. I'm going to explain it. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shehakol nihiyah bidvaro. Batsheva was married to a guy named Uriah. David sees this woman, Batsheva, who was married to Uriah on the rooftop, finds out that she was married, and calls her over to his house, and they conceive a child together. That's all we know from these psukim right here. I don't think that this particular inclusion of where he came from is supposed to be demeaning at all. It's just giving us context of where he's coming from. I hear why you're saying that, but I don't think so. I think if anything, it could be a positive thing that he came from a place that was filled with idolaters, and he became more than that. You know what I'm saying? Like he about Tshuva, we say b'makom she'bal Tshuva omdim, in the place where about Tshuva stands, tzadikim gemurim lo omdim, like that. About Tshuva is greater than a righteous person. No, so you're right, but as a way, it doesn't have to be seen as Ganai. It doesn't have to be seen in a negative kind of way. It can be very positive, that he came from this place, and he's this very interesting, growing person who's fighting in the army, trying to go ahead and overtake the Philistines who were occupying the lands that they were trying to conquer. It doesn't have to be seen as a negative thing. I see why you're saying that. I don't. Yeah, okay, I hear it. I hear that. I don't see it. I don't see that. I don't see it that way. I saw it like that originally, but I think you could see it both ways. I don't think it has to be like that. I don't think we have to go there yet. Okay. Yes. Batsheva was Jewish, 100%. What's that? What's she doing bathing on the roof? So back then, right, you had mikvaot, and they're often on the roof. Why were they on the roof? That's right. That's where you had your cisterns. And it was late at night, and she was going to the roof. So now two things. One explanation is that she was, the Midrashim tell us that she was going to the mikvah, that she had her mikvah on the roof, and she had just finished her menstrual cycle, and she was getting herself purified. Correct. Right. Exactly. So great question. So we're going to get there, and this is exactly why I'm late, ladies. I want to answer all your questions, but there has to be order in the court for us to walk away with understanding and clarity. So I said this in my introduction that I know this is a sensitive subject. So please, we're going to get there together. I don't mind the questions. If there are clarifying questions, I'll answer them. But let's not get into the emotional parts of it yet. Yeah. No, we know that he was Jewish. I dealt with that. He is either a convert or a Baal Teshuvah. However we understand it, he was 100% Jewish. Because that's what the Midrash. I don't know. I can't tell you how I know it. Why the Hittite part of it in the pasuk is there. One opinion in this class is that it's a way of Gnai, a way of saying that he's not a good guy. He's really a bad guy. But I don't think that's what the pasuk is doing, because and the reason why I'm saying that is because of the way in which the Navi admonishes David later for his actions. But I don't want to get there. That's more of like a side distraction. Yeah, go ahead. Right, right. So even if, she's saying that if he's not Jewish, then there's no kedushin there, and therefore he was never really technically married to her, because a Jewish woman can't marry a non-Jew. Yeah, but that's not what happens here, because if that was in fact the case, then David would not have been punished in the way he was punished. That's why I'm saying hold on a little bit, hold your questions. We're going to get there. You'll see how the whole thing fits together. Okay, I want to point out this Gemara before we move on as another disclaimer for the next series of Pesukim. Okay, the Gemara in Shabbat says as follows. It says, Amar Rabbi Shmuel. Shmuel ben Nachmani says, anyone who says that David sinned with Batsheva is nothing other than mistaken, as is stated. And David succeeded in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. We have to contend with that. Right? Pasuk, he's quoting a Pasuk in Shmuel that says that God was with David in everything that he did. God was with David with everything that he did. Right? Is it possible that sin came to his hand and nevertheless the divine presence was with him? We have to be able to establish certain principles. Okay? Number one, do we believe that there is a God? Number two, do we believe that God is just? Okay, so we have to answer that question for ourselves. If you say, I don't believe that God is just, and you're right, then I can't help you with understanding the story. It'll make no sense to you. I believe that there's a God, and therefore that means that he's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, and he is just. I believe in justice. I don't believe we always have the merit of seeing how justice plays itself out, but I believe in justice that it happens. Sometimes it takes generations for it to happen, but it always happens. It'll happen no matter what. Karma, it'll find you. God will find you. You can't hide from it. What's that? I'm not trying to. I don't understand. I don't know how it justifies. The ends justify the means. I don't know, because the bottom line is God is the puppet master and he's arranging things. It's not an accident that for whatever reason you are here today in this class. For whatever reason you need to hear something I had to say, and that will set off a whole nother set of events that will hopefully lead you to a bit bigger, better, greater place. Okay, with more shefa and baracha and everything that you do. Okay, or it's there to help you think. It's there to help you question. Whatever it is, it's there. You're here for a reason. Nothing happens accidentally. Okay, and therefore, if that in fact is true, that we believe that God is just, the verse states very clearly that God was with David. How could he be with a sinner? If David was a clear out sinner, the pasuk cannot state that God was with him in everything that he did. Okay, so either you'll deal with what? Just like Yehoshuah. In what way? With Yehuda and Tamar. I was going to say Rachva, but okay. But you're right. But just similar, not exactly the same. Similar, but not the same. In many ways, I would argue that with Yehuda it was more complicated. Right? In many ways, it was worse. Right, than this situation with Batsheva, and we'll see why in a moment. Okay, the Pasukim continue, so I apologize. I just wanted that to be there. It's not my opinion. The rabbis in the Gemara are very clear that, if you're looking at the story and you're saying right away that it's obvious, we're going to pass judgment that this man is a sinner, you do not understand the story, and I'll help you understand it if you give me a chance. Okay, number 6. Vayishlach David et El Yoav. Now, he finds out that she's pregnant. Okay, and this guy was, and Uriah was married to Batsheva. He sends a message to Yoav, the chief commander, and he says, "Send Uriah, right? At Uriah, send Hachiti Uriah to me, El David. Vayavo Uriah elav, and he comes to him. Meishal David l'shalom Yoav, l'shalom ha'am, l'shalom ha'milchama." And he wants to know what's going on. Tell me a little about the war. Now, remember, at this point, this interaction. David had already slept with what we think is Uriah's wife. Okay? And the reason why I say think is because there was a special clause that took place in the old ancient world of battle, right? If a man, or when a man went to war, there were two different scenarios that would always take place. If you would agree that to go out to war, then you had to give your wife a special get, a special divorce document that says that I am divorcing you now. And the reason why men would do this back then is in case they were taken captive or lost at battle. We did not want to create a situation where a woman would be an eguna. We did not want her to be stuck, and therefore we would protect her by divorcing her. It's a weird kind of thing, right? But it's also beautiful that they were sensitive. What's that? No, they were sensitive to them, right? That's one way of understanding how this was done. There's another opinion, however, that states that's not how it worked, right? The other opinion states that that's not how it worked. The way it would work is that a man would say that he's going to battle for a certain amount of time, and if he did not come back after that certain amount of time, they would be divorced retroactively. But however you understand it, according to both opinions, we believe that in this situation with David and Uriah, that Uriah had either given Batsheva a divorce paper, and therefore they were not legally married, or number two is that the time had passed already, and therefore, irrespective, they were no longer married. And therefore, there's no scenario where David was with Batsheva where she was married. There cannot be a scenario where David was with Batsheva married. Let me tell you why. If Batsheva was in fact married when David was with her, two things would have happened. One is David could have never married her. You cannot marry an Eshet Ish. You cannot marry a woman that's married to somebody else, period. And if in fact they had this illicit relationship where she was in fact married, at that point Batsheva would be prohibited from David to marry forever. He can never marry her. That's number one. Number two is that if in fact he was unable to marry her, right, because she was married, then Batsheva could have never gone back to her husband, right? It goes both ways. So if we look at the story, there has to be a scenario where this was his wife. They were in fact divorced. We're in this weird gray zone where the marriage legally came to an end, okay, and David exploited this opportunity. I'm going to use that word exploited because that's the same way, the same similar lashon the Pesukim used to describe what David did. And we'll notice, and this is me kind of like I guess preempting the attacks I'm going to get, is that when we look at the critique of Natan the Navi to David, he never accuses him of adultery. He never said you sinned with adultery. But in reality, what he accuses him is of abuse of power. What you did was abuse of your power. And we'll see that inside as well. Okay. Clear? Yes.
If Uriah came back and didn't die in battle, would he have remarried Batsheva, or she could go on and marry somebody else?
If he came back and did not die and marry, they have a choice to make at that point. They could remarry again. It's something that
So all the men that were going off to battle, their wives were divorced, and then they could have a new husband.
Correct, they could.
Well, that kind of...
Well, it's very liberal back then to give a woman that to give women that freedom. Yes. I'm sure it happened often. Shh. The fact that the child was a mamzer, of whether, we would know that also, right? But again, remember, I want you to just carry these thoughts with you, okay, again, right? The Pesukim didn't have to tell us the story. We don't have to know the story. Could have just erased it. No one would have known. This is something that happens on a rooftop on some hot summer night, in Jerusalem. No one would have ever known anything about it. Yeah, we're gonna. Yes, it is, right? There's a lot over here. Okay, so the Torah does not need to teach us about it. That we see the critique of Natan, and then later on when we see the birth of Shlomo HaMelech, we know that he's not an illegitimate child. But we still have to ask another question, which is why this way? Why does this relationship need to occur in this interesting kind of way? The Gemara tells us, the Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us that we know that Batsheva and David were soulmates. They were bashert. They were supposed to get married at some point, right? But the question is, why this way? Why in this way? Why does this relationship need to evolve in this unique kind of way? So let's just finish these psukim. Let's see the Maharal together, and then we're going to keep going further. I don't want this class to be longer than an hour. When it does, I can't post it on Instagram. It becomes complicated. Mechila. I need the class to be less than 59 minutes and 59 seconds, so that I can post it. So I'm gonna try to finish it a little bit earlier, so I can have it out there. And then if we need to finish it, because last week, whatever it is, and it doesn't matter. All right, fine. Yeah, let's try to hold the questions for a little bit. I want to get to this next piece over here, and then we'll pause again for a little bit of questions, and then we'll keep moving. Okay. David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house, go bathe your feet." Right, and Uriah left the royal palace. Right, a present from the king followed him, but Uriah slept at the entrance of the royal palace along with the other officers of his king, and did not go down to his house. He disobeyed David. And when David was told that Uriah had not gone down to his house, and he said to Uriah, "You just came from a journey. Why didn't you go down to your house?" Uriah answered David, "The ark of Israel, the talk about the Aron, right, and Israel and Judah are located at Sukkot, and my master Yoav and your majesty's men are camped in the open. How can I go home and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As you live by your very life, I will not do this." This was a direct him saying, "I will not listen to the word of the king." Now remember that a king wasn't a president, okay? That a king had the role as a judge as well. And therefore, if the king says, "I want you to go home," that becomes a royal command. And if you choose to disobey the word of the king, you know what happens? You are able to be put to death. Okay? And this is exactly where the Maharal goes. So Uriah said, look at number 4, Maharal. He says, Uriah's manner of speech was an act of insubordination to the king for 2 reasons. 1, instead of referring to his commanding general as your servant Yoav, Uriah insolently referred to him as in the king's presence as my lord. And Uriah emphatically defied the king's directives. Although Yoav, as Uriah's commanding general, was truly his lord, Uriah should have referred to Yoav as your servant, my lord Yoav. Although David was technically justified in regarding Uriah's reference as an insult, a man as great as David would not have condemned this miscreant to death for such a trivial remark, were it not for his desire to cover up his liaison with Batsheva, which he could have easily have done. This is why David is severely criticized for causing Uriah to die. The Talmud, the same Gemara we quoted earlier, states that David should have had Uriah judge in the Sanhedrin, even though the king had the prerogative of acting unilaterally. His failing to bring Uriah to the high court proved that his concern was not for the honor of the throne, but to prevent his relationship with Batsheva from becoming public knowledge, which means that he was more interested in covering up what could have been the Chilul Hashem of this relationship. Now, technically speaking, right, in law, there are gray zones. Okay? When we talk about legal matters, there are gray zones. Nothing is clear cut. We have tax law. Okay, fascinating issues in law. How do I pay my taxes? How does it work? How much money do I pay? It depends on all these issues. And there's always going to be a little bit of gray in everything. You have a choice to make. Okay, you could pay above and beyond what's owed just to make sure, right? Or you could pay less and then go through a case with the IRS to figure out how much you actually owe. Okay? Technically speaking, he was the king. He had the right to go ahead and put Uriah on the front lines and have him killed. Okay, because anyone on the front lines is most likely going to die, which is what happens later. Okay, or what he could have done, which would have been the right thing to do, is have a case. Take Uriah to the court and say, listen, this man was guilty of insubordination. Okay, I gave an explicit command to him. He disobeyed me. He went ahead and he spoke in a way which is undignified for a commoner to speak to a king. Another form of insubordination. Those 2 things are deserving of the death penalty. Standing in front of a king, it's got to have some level of trepidation and honor. He did not exhibit those things, and therefore he was chayav mitah. That should have been something that the court decided for David, but not David. Why? Because David was already somewhat. He was, what's that? It was more than that. He was nogeba davar, right? He was someone who had his own interests. Right? He was biased. That was what I was looking for. He was biased because he wanted to get rid of this guy. I want to get rid of this guy. I want to sweep him under the rug. Technically, he's justifying himself. He's saying, you know what? I did nothing wrong over here. They're not married. Yeah, I was with his wife, And there was this gray area, but I don't want this matter to get out because this is great tabloid stuff, and I want to easily sweep this under the rug. If he dies, no one will know it. Then I could go ahead and move beyond it, and this kid with Batsheva will be accepted. No one will know anything, and yallah. Okay? He wants to sweep it under the rug, but how could he be worrying about this? Right? Doesn't King David, know that God is watching? Right? Well, what was he doing over here? How does he justify all of this? We're talking about a Navi. We're talking about a person who is connected to God. He's singing, and all the Tehillim that we recite comes from this guy, right? Again, remember, the Tanakh does not need to tell us this story. It's doing it for a reason, and we don't know why yet. But the Maharal is telling us that we look at just Uriah and the way he spoke, he was deserving of death. The second reason Uriah was considered a rebel is that his pious declaration of concern for the ark, his commander and his colleagues, was an implied rebuke to David, as if to say, it is I, Uriah, who has the decency not to enjoy the comforts of home when my people are in danger, why my king expects me to indulge in passions at such a time. Did you miss that in the Pasuk? Right? He went so far to swear by your own life and the life of your soul that he would not obey. That, my friends, is disrespectful. David was legally entitled to have him put to death, a course of action which, in fact, he later decided to follow. Uriah was disrespectful, referring to Yoav of his lord, the king's presence, even though Yoav was a great man, David's highest officer, the one whose command of the army made it possible for David to study Torah and to serve God. All the people are equal in the presence of the king, and the most noble, the most humble. Okay, so here you have, according to the Maharal, you have a very clear scenario where there are two reasons why Uriah was deserving of death. Now, what happens? Okay, Pasuk says, "V'yishlach Yoav v'yigad leDavid et kol derei hamilchama." At this point, I skipped a whole bunch of Pasukim. I don't want to go through all of it. But David tells Yoav to put Uriah on the front lines. Front lines back then meant you weren't going to survive. Typically speaking, in every single battle, when you're part of a army, everyone has their mission. Everyone on the front line knows that you're willing to advance and risk your life so that we could keep advancing and get to reach our goal. And the next group of people are willing to sacrifice their lives to go on. Uriah is sent to the front lines in the most difficult part of the battle, and he is killed in battle. Now Yoav knows what's going on. V'yishlach Yoav v'yugad leDavid kol divrei hamilchama v'yitzav et hamalach le'mor kekalotecha kol divrei milchama ledaber el hamelech v'im ha'ayta levacha. He tells him everything that's happening. So he says, why did you come close to the city to attack it? Don't you know they would shoot from the wall? Why did you ask me to put Uriah in this place? And he says, don't worry about it. It's all good. Everyone knows that people on the front line die. Right? So then he says, why did you come so close to the wall? Then say, your servant Uriah the Hittite was among those who were killed. Which means that everyone knows that Uriah had a fiery personality. Even if people are going to come back and claim that, oh, I put Uriah at the front lines, who said that he had to go as far as he did? He put his own life in danger. He was deserving of all these other issues of death for insubordination and for being disrespectful. And in addition to his own fiery personality, he himself is responsible for his own life because that's just the way it is. You die when God says your time is to go. But we know the Pasuk says, "V'tishma eshet Uriah kimet Uriah." Right? We know that his wife, Uriah's wife, heard that Batsheva hears this. V'tispod al ba'ala. She mourns the loss of her husband. V'yavor ha'evel v'yishlach David v'yasefa. After the mourning period comes to an end, he doesn't stop this guy, right? The mourning period comes to an end, and he brings Batsheva to his house. V'tihi lo leisha v'tel lo ben. Right? Now, my question is, why did Batsheva say no? Why did she go along with it? If she's mourning the loss of her husband, and David says, "Hey, come on over. It's clear now. It's over." What's that? No, I'm not sure. I want to say that, but I think there's something bigger happening here. Okay, good. Number one is she was pregnant. Well, what else is going on here, ladies? Who made the invite? No, this is not about her power. Who was David? Thank you. He's the king. The king knocks on the door. You say, "Okay, I'm coming." What time do you want me to be there? There was no room for your own personal feeling over here, right? When the Melech knocks on the door and says, "I want you to come over now," you're coming over. Because if you don't, insubordination. Next thing you'll know, you'll be fighting on the front lines. Okay? So there was no choice over here for Batsheva. She had no choice but to obey. Now, obviously, they had a strong relationship because we see that Shlomo Melech isn't this, a hated child, and Batsheva is not telling Shlomo to hate his father at all. There's clearly some kind of a relationship, a cosmic connection the two of them have with each other, no question about it. But just be mindful again that the person that's asking is the king of your country, the king of your land. There was no way she could say no. Okay? Now, having said all this, the next piece over here, number 7 in the source sheet, is this particular Tehillim Nun Aleph. Okay? This Nun Aleph was what King David wrote in response to his mistakes and how he handled the situation. All right? Let's read it together. Okay? He says, for the leader of Psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet came to him after he had come to Batsheva, have mercy upon me, O God, as befits your faithfulness, in keeping with your abundant compassion. Blot out my transgressions, wash me thoroughly of my iniquity, and purify me of sin. For I recognize my transgressions, and I am ever conscious of my sin. Against you alone have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight. So you are just in your sentence, and right in your judgment. Indeed, I was born with iniquity, and sin my mother conceived me. Right? We know what that's talking about. We'll deal with that a little bit later. Indeed, you desire truth about that which is hidden. Teach me wisdom about secret things. Purge me with hyssop till I am pure. Wash me till I am whiter than snow. Let me hear tidings of joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed exult. Hide your face from my sins, blot out all my iniquities, fashion a pure heart for me. O God, create me in a steadfast spirit. Do not cast me out of your presence, or take your Holy Spirit away from me. Let me again rejoice in your help. Let a vigorous spirit sustain me. I will teach transgressions your ways. The sinners may return to you. Save me from blood guilt. Let's go back. Let's read that again. Number 15. I will teach your transgressors your ways, that sinners may return to you. Save me from my blood guilt, O God, my deliverer, that I may sing forth your beneficence, O Lord, upon my lips, and let my mouth declare your praise. You do not want me to bring sacrifices. You do not desire burnt offerings. True sacrifices are God contrite. O God, despite the contrite and the crushed heart, may it please you to make Zion prosper, rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will want the sacrifice offered in the righteousness, burnt the whole offerings. Then bulls will be offered to your altar, and so on and so forth. Okay. What sin did he commit?
You just said he didn't commit sin.
I didn't say he didn't commit sin. I didn't say that.
He said he committed sin.
I know. What was the sin that he committed, though? What was the sin that he committed? First of all, before we go into the sin, because we haven't really got to the sin yet, we haven't clarified it yet, I want to highlight this one piece over here. First of all, is what he's saying sincere? Right? I would argue that it's sincere. I would argue that that people can make mistakes, and that for whatever reason, the heat of the passion, the moment, however you want to understand it, that there are scenarios where people can do things and they have horrible consequences and they regret it. There are people that regret. Well-intentioned people, poor choice, poor reaction to whatever the scenario was, and they make mistakes. And that if someone goes ahead and sincerely apologizes and fixes the scenario that he's in, we should accept that apology. And that's a hard thing for us. Well, he's a cheater, right? He's an abuse of power, right? What's that? Yes, he definitely feels guilty. My question is over here, was this act of regret and repentance genuine? Was it real?
Why did he have to repent if everything he did was according to the law?
Because remember that we're not judging him with in the typical way we would judge someone. I argued earlier that his punishment was abuse of power. That this episode did not have to unfold the way it did. The Kabbalists say it a little bit differently. What was David doing on the rooftop? He was looking up and gazing at heaven, and he was having a prophetic moment with God. And he sees the throne of heaven, and he notices that on God's throne there are 4, poles that are upholding the seat of God. And he sees the names of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob on the throne, and he sees that there's one spot missing. So David looks up to God and says, God, how do you get your name chiseled out on the chair over there? I want to get my name in there. He says, well, these guys were tested and they passed the test. And because they passed their test, I inscribed their name on my throne. So David looks at God and says, you know what? I want you to test me. Okay? So Hashem says, you want to be tested? No problem. Prophecy comes to an end. Okay? He comes out of his prophetic state, and the first thing he sees is Batsheva. In that moment. From one to another, from a prophetic state into this moment of realization that he's being, not even realize that he's being tested. He's tested. And he fails his test. And the Chachamim tell us that we never ever ask to be tested. No one wants to be tested. Because the only way that we have the ability of overcoming our test is with divine inspiration. There is no test we should ever want. No one wants to be in a test. We don't want tests. We don't want the reward of the test. We don't want to be challenged on the test. We don't want to be tested, period. And David is there to show us this lesson. That we don't ask to be tested, because if we are tested, we're probably going to fail the test. Okay? He fails the test. But even though he fails, even though he makes these bad choices, he still has the ability of rectifying himself. He has the ability of doing the teshuvah. He has the ability of asking for mechila, of doing selicha, kapara, and doing everything he can to reboot himself as a human being. But look what happens next. Turn the page, number 8. Okay? Vayishlach Hashem et Natan al David. God sends his prophet Natan to David. Okay? And he says to him, I want to ask you the following scenario. I want to give you the scenario. I want to understand how you will interpret it. What do you do in this following case? Okay, there were two men in the same city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had a very large flocks and herds, but the poor man had only one little ewe lamb, right? And he had bought, and he tended it, and he grew it up together with him and his children. And he used to share with his morsels of bread and drink from this cup and the nestle on the bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Okay, they were very close. One day, a traveler came to the rich man, but he was loath to take anything from his own flocks. His herds prepared for the meal, the guests who had come to him. So he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. David flew into a rage against this man and said to Natan, as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He shall pay for the lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and showed up no pity. How could you go ahead and take this guy, your friend, and abuse your position of power, you rich man, steal from this poor? How could you do this? That guy deserves to die. So what does Natan say? Natan el David, Ataish, you're that guy. You're that guy. You're that guy. Right? Brilliant. Okay? God, this is what God says. Ko amar Hashem Elokai Yisrael. Anochi, I, who anointed you king over Israel, and it was I who rescued you from the hands of Shaul. I gave you your master's house and possessions of your master's wives. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. If that were not enough, I would give you twice as much more. Why then have you flouted the command of the Lord and done what displeases him? You have put Uriah the Hittite to the sword. You took his wife and made her your wife, and had him killed by the sword of the Ammonites. Therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you spurned me by taking the wife of Uriah the Hittite and making her your wife. Thus says the Lord, this is what God says, I will make a calamity rise against you from within your own house. I will take the wives and give them to another man before your very eyes, and he will sleep with the wives under the very sun. You acted in secret, but I will make this happen in the sight of all of Israel and in broad daylight. David says to Natan, I stand guilty before the Lord. And Natan says to David, the Lord has remitted your sin and you shall not die. However, since you have spurned the enemies of the Lord by this deed, even the child about to be born to you shall die. Natan went home, and the Lord afflicted the child of Uriah's wife that had been born to David, and it became critically ill. Okay, she gave birth, Batsheva, we find that over here. And the baby gets sick, and David, he goes ahead and he prays before God, and he asks God, he fasts, and he goes in and he spent the night lying on the ground. The senior servant of the household tried to induce him to get up from the ground, but he refused, nor would he partake in the food with him. On the 7th day, the child dies. 7 days later, after hearing this child from this union dies. David's servants were afraid to tell David that the child was dead. Right? They said if we speak to him when the child was alive and he would listen to us, how can we tell him the child is dead? He might do something terrible. We're so afraid of him. They were terrified of David. When David saw his servants talking in whispers, he understood that the child was dead. David asked his servants, is the child dead? They said yes. At that point, David gets up from the ground, right? He bathed and he anointed himself and he changed his clothes and he went into the house of the Lord. He prostrated himself, and then he went home and asked for food, which they set before him, right? His couriers, his servants asked him, why have you acted in this manner? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you rise up and take food? So this is what he says. He says, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept because I thought, who knows? Maybe God will have pity on me and the child, and he may live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? Shall I go to him? But he will never come back to me. David consoles his wife Batsheva. He went to her and laid with her. She bore a son. She named him Solomon. The Lord favored him, and he sent a message through the prophet Natan, and he was named Yedidiah at an instance of the Lord. Okay, so this is later this relationship he has with Batsheva. He returns again, but this is a very interesting dynamic over here, right? You, on the one hand, you have Natan coming in and giving him this scolding, musar, rebuking him. How could you do this? You're going to be punished. This is a horrible thing. This is a horrible sentence. Not easy to hear all of that for anybody, let alone David HaMelech, right? And this is a nevuah. This is a prophecy. This is a prophecy that Natan's speaking on behalf of God. This was abuse of power. You went ahead. It doesn't say that you took a wife that was prohibited to you. It says you took a wife. You took someone and you used your power in a situation which you were not supposed to, and you abused your power, right? That was an abuse of power, and therefore the same exact thing. Right? There's no punishment. There's no mention of Eshet Ish at all. No mention at all that you slept with a married woman, because we don't see this in the Psukim at all. The verses don't tell us that he slept with a married wife. He took a wife that he wasn't supposed to take. That's an abuse of power. Okay, he had a relation with someone he was not supposed to have a relationship with. Okay, but therefore this child dies. And you see the pain of David recognizing his own sin and his mistake, and he owns it. And we see this same thing play out with Yehudah. He could have easily brushed this whole story under the rug. But the power of being from the Shevet of Yehudah, what makes our saints respectable, is the fact that they could admit their sin. Okay, we could acknowledge the fact that they did something wrong, and we have the power of forgiving them. That instead of losing himself to depression, instead of giving up hope, he finds the strength within him to stand up, recognize, admit his mistakes, and move on. Right? And I believe that is the uniqueness about the tribe of Judah, Yehudah, specifically admitting his mistakes to Tamar, and over here again, David admitting the mistakes of Batsheva. Okay, admitting that he did something wrong. Now, if he was with her and she was an Eshet Ish, he could not marry her. Shlomo Melech could never have been existed. Okay, that relation could have never happened. But because it did happen, right? No one would have allowed it. None of the rabbis, Natan wouldn't, the prophet wouldn't allow it. You have to make up your mind. This is what you believe. If Natan is a prophet of the Lord, right, and he knows what's going on, he would have never allowed David to continue that relationship. But the fact that he does, and the Sanhedrin and everyone else, these are law-abiding citizens that are there to put the king and his power at check. Remember, God does not want there to be a king, right? We don't want a king in Am Yisrael. We think that's a chisaron. The fact that the Am Yisrael asked for a king, God said, you want a king? You want to be like other people? Fine, have it. That's not ideal. Why would you want to surrender freedoms to a king? We have a body called the Sanhedrin, a court of law, and that is where the law of the land comes from, not from one individual. But you want to empower him and give this man power? Fine, have a king. But that's not the ideal. As a matter of fact, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, when it speaks about Mashiach and talks about whether or not the Jewish people had a Mashiach, will he come or not come, there's one opinion, which we disagree with, that says, Ed Mashiach LiYisrael. The Jewish people don't have Mashiach. Why? We already ate the merits of Mashiach during the times of Chizkiyahu. He was the Mashiach, and that's it, there's no more Mashiach. Rashi points out, what does it mean, En Mashiach LiYisrael? He says, why would we want a Mashiach or a king? We want Kutshu Brichu, we want God Ba'atzmo. I don't want to have an intermediary between me and God. I don't want a Mashiach. I want a relationship with God. I want to have direct access. That's what it means when we say that we're going to be a Mamlechet Kohanim, a nation of priests. You're supposed to be Kedoshim to you. You're supposed to have direct access. You don't need to have a relationship with some guru to help you get to God. You each have the ability of having your unique path to connecting to the Almighty. You don't need somebody else. And the fact that we speak about Mashiach, the Savior, the Savior, the Savior, it's almost on some level says, well, it's not going to be me, it's going to be somebody else. Somebody else will take on that responsibility, when in fact it's supposed to be our responsibility to do that. So however we slice this particular story of David and Batsheva, we're not finished with it yet, but I was just kind of like introducing it here today. The way in which I see it is that like this. Yes, he made mistakes. But don't think that the mistake was an adulterous one. I don't see it in the Psukim at all. I have a hard time seeing it. I think that's what the Gemara means, that if you walk away from the story thinking that there was adultery here, you are not understanding the Psukim at all. There's no way Natan would have allowed him to remain with a woman that was asur to him. There's no way that Natan would have allowed a king, Shlomo, to sit on the king, as a king of the Jewish people, to be the heir of Mashiach, someone who was sullied in the sin of adultery. It doesn't work like that. Judaism is not afraid to tell the story. We're not afraid to go ahead and speak of the things that are uncomfortable, but at the same time, we're also willing to forgive those that have sinned. And I think that is the bigger lesson for me in the story. It's not as much as that David sinned. He's a man, he's going to sin. We're all going to sin. We're not perfect. We're far from perfect. But the question is, what do we do afterwards? Do we lose ourselves to those moments and say, well, I'm a sinner, I'm bad, I'm no good, and therefore I stop believing in myself? Or do we find the strength to move forward, carry on, and keep growing? And I believe that's the story of David. David's greatness, his Tehillim, his Psalms, are all these stories or inspirational verses about how mankind is far from perfect, but since we have a forgiving God, we can move on from our past. Our past don't have to define us. We can still become great. Your past does not define who you are. You have the power of looking deep within yourselves right here, right now, and creating a new future for yourselves. Don't be stuck in the past. David could have been stuck in the past, depressing. I lost a son. I had this horrible prophecy against my family. He could have just got depressed and closed shop. That's not what he does. He stands up. He figures out a way of recognizing that he did what he could. He tried doing his teshuvah, and he kept moving forward. I believe that is the lesson of David, and God willing, we will continue this particular aspect of David and Batsheva next week. I'm going to stop this right here, and I'll take your questions and comments.